The pressure of the American road in the mid-20th century was a silent, grinding machine that chewed through men and machinery with equal indifference. It wasn't just the physical toll of navigating a Mack truck through a blinding Nebraska blizzard, or the sweltering, humid nights of the Mississippi Delta where the mosquitoes were thick enough to clog a radiator. It was the economic weight, the thin margin of a farm ledger in the rural Midwest, where one bad harvest meant the difference between the dinner table and the auction block. In those years, there was a quiet, lingering shame attached to what we now consider our most prized traditions. People didn't call it heritage cooking when they were boiling calf's liver or stretching a single ham hock to flavor a 10-pound pot of pinto beans. They called it making do. It was poor food, the kind of meals eaten by people who knew the exact price of a gallon of milk and the soul-crushing cost of a failed engine. But when that poor food hit the seasoned flat top of a truck stop diner in 1966, it underwent a transformation. It became the high-calorie fuel of a nation in motion. Number 14 on our list, the ham steak with red-eye gravy, is perhaps the ultimate example of American resourcefulness meeting the demands of the night. You have to understand that in the South, nothing was ever wasted, least of all the dark, savory fond left in the bottom of a cast-iron skillet. When a cook took a thick slice of salt-cured country ham and seared it until the edges were a deep, caramelized mahogany, she wasn't just cooking meat, she was creating the foundation for a ritual. Adding a splash of black coffee to that hot pan to scrape up the salt and the smoke wasn't a culinary trend. It was a necessity, born from a time when coffee was the only thing more valuable than the ham itself. A driver pulling into a gravel lot at midnight in Georgia didn't care that the elite in the cities looked down on such a humble plate. To him, that salty, caffeinated sauce was the best cup of coffee he'd ever eaten, a 55-cent miracle that could carry him another 300 miles. The shame of poor food evaporated the moment the steam hit his face. Then there was number 13, the calf's liver and caramelized onions, a dish that separates the generations more cleanly than any border on a map. In 1966, it was 59 cents a pound, making it the most economical way to put protein into a driver's system. But it was more than that. The older men, the ones who had seen the inside of a Great Depression breadline and the outside of a European foxhole, swore by it. They believed it kept their vision sharp through the Kentucky fog and their nerves steady when the brakes started to fade on a downhill grade. There was a specific discipline to it, searing it fast on a screaming hot surface so it stayed tender, then burying it under a mountain of onions that had been sweated down in butter until they were as soft and sweet as a memory. Younger drivers might have turned their noses up at it, but the veterans knew better. That was the era of the hot beef sandwich, our number 12, which was the final evolution of Sunday's pot roast. By Monday afternoon, that roast had been sliced thin and laid across white bread, then absolutely submerged in a brown gravy so thick it could hold a spoon upright. In 1967, for 65 cents, a man who had been away from his family for 9 days could sit on a vinyl stool and feel, for 20 minutes, like he was back in his own dining room in Indiana. The gravy soaked into the bread soaked into everything, and the world outside the diner window, the wind, the wages, the looming bills, seemed to stop. Number 11 takes us into the heart of the Midwest with the pork chop and applesauce plate. In 1964, this was the Tuesday night law in truck stops from Ohio to Iowa. 2 thick, bone-in chops browned in a skillet until the fat rendered into a crisp, salty rind, then finished in the oven until the meat practically fell away from the bone. It was served with green beans, cooked for hours, with a hunk of fatback and a side of sweetened applesauce that tasted like a September morning. For 75 cents, a man ate like a king, and he didn't need to stop his rig again until the sun came up over the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Then there was number 10, the beef stew and cornbread. The pot went on the burner at 7 in the morning in a diner outside of St. Louis, and it didn't come off until the bottom was scraped clean. This wasn't a delicate soup. It was a dark, thick broth, clinging to chunks of beef, carrots, and potatoes, served with a wedge of cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet. 55 cents in 1966 got you a bowl that was perfect by noon and transcendent by 4. If you arrived at 4:15 and the stew was gone, you got chili instead, and you weren't happy about it. We call these forgotten because we chose to forget the struggle that made them necessary. The spine of a great American meal wasn't found in a glossy cookbook. It was forged in the heat of a kitchen that never closed, built on a foundation of cast iron discipline and the kind of intuition that only comes after 40 years behind a stove. In the 1960s, the engineering of a plate was a matter of both survival and physics, a balance of high-calorie fuel and the deep, smoky flavors of the American landscape. Take number 9 on our list, biscuits and sausage gravy. Even today, this dish costs under $2 to recreate, yet it tastes exactly the way America used to smell at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere. In 1963, for 35 cents, it was known to every driver from the Virginia hills to the California coast as a gut bomb, and it was constructed with the precision of a craftsman. The secret wasn't in the flour, but in the fat. You browned the country sausage in a heavy skillet until it crumbled into dark, peppery jewels. But you never, ever drained the pan. That rendered fat was the soul of the gravy, the smokehouse trick that turned a simple meal into an event. You stirred in the flour to create a roux that smelled like toasted grain, then added whole milk slowly, whisking until it transformed into a thick, speckled velvet that could coat a spoon like lead. This was American alchemy. Whether it was 2 in the morning in a Kansas rainstorm or high noon in the Arizona heat, a trucker with 500 miles of winding road ahead of him needed something that would stick to his ribs like wet cement. This was the era before the assembly line took over, when a cook understood that a man driving alone for 12 hours needed more than a tray. He needed a booth wide enough for a heavy work jacket and a coffee cup that stayed full without a word being spoken. The chains never understood that the room was as vital as the food, and now that world is disappearing into the fog of history. Number 8, the meatloaf plate, was a testament to the American workweek and the brilliance of the leftover. It was born on a Monday morning in kitchens across Pennsylvania and Ohio. A mixture of ground beef, breadcrumbs soaked in milk, egg, and a sharp, savory hit of Worcestershire sauce. It was packed into a loaf pan and baked until a ketchup glaze caramelized into a dark, sticky crust. In 1967, it cost 59 cents. But the real magic happened 48 hours later. Truck stop meatloaf was always better on Wednesday than it was on Monday. 2 days in the refrigerator gave the ingredients time to settle, to think about what they wanted to be, and to absorb the salt and spice into every fiber. By midweek, the cook would slice it thick and sear it on the flat top until the edges were crisp and blackened, serving it alongside mashed potatoes and green beans that had been simmered so long they practically melted. The drivers who knew the rhythm of the road ordered it specifically on those days, seeking that charred, home-style perfection. Then we move south, below the Mason-Dixon line and out toward the humid stretches of East Texas for number 7, fried catfish with hush puppies. On a Friday night in 1965, if you were within 30 miles of a river, you didn't need to look at the menu. You just listened for the sizzle of the buttermilk soak and the cornmeal dredge. The fillets were submerged in seasoned cornmeal and dropped into a bubbling vat of oil until the crust shattered between your teeth like glass. Alongside them went the hush puppies, spoonfuls of cornmeal batter fried in that same oil until they were golden nuggets of pure American calories. At 49 cents a pound, it was the ritual of the roadside, served with hot sauce on the table and a lemon wedge on the plate. For 20 minutes, the dust of the panhandle or the humidity of the bayou didn't matter. These dishes weren't designed by a corporate committee. They were built by women who used what they had, substituted when they must, and never apologized for the smoke or the salt. This was the food spine of a country still finding its way, one cast iron skillet at a time. History is written by the victors, but memory is kept by the hungry. And in the archives of the American road, the names of the people who actually fed the nation have been quietly erased. We record the names of the men who laid the concrete of the Lincoln Highway or the engineers who designed the interchanges of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. But we never talk about the woman in a grease-stained apron who worked a 16-hour shift in a diner outside of Flagstaff. She didn't have a corporate handbook or a digital timer. She had the rhythm of the road in her hands. By the mid-1980s, the records showed that consistency had won the commercial war. The chains offered the same burger in Amarillo that you got in Albany, a predictable, sanitized experience that removed the risk of a bad meal. But in that victory, we lost the record of the individual. We lost the cook, who knew exactly when the humidity in a Kentucky morning was going to affect the rise of her biscuits, or how a cold snap in the Ozarks meant the beef stew needed an extra hour on the back burner. This brings us to number 6 on our list: chicken and dumplings, the dish that earned its reputation as the Great American Road Meal. In 1964, for 55 cents, this was the closest thing a driver had to a home he hadn't seen in 3 weeks. It was built on a whole chicken, simmered in a pot of seasoned broth until the meat surrendered and fell from the bone. The bones were cleared away, the meat shredded back in, and then came the magic. Spoonfuls of biscuit dough dropped into the roiling liquid. They had to be covered and left alone, steaming until they puffed up into pillowy clouds that absorbed every drop of the chicken-rich broth. It was a dish of patience and timing, something no assembly line could ever replicate. By 1985, the formula had flipped, and the Howard Johnsons of the world, which once outsold McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken combined, began to vanish. They were replaced by a world where the cook was just another part of the machinery, and the chicken and dumplings disappeared because they took too long to make. Number 5 is country fried chicken, the slow kind that defined Sundays from the Shenandoah Valley to the plains of Oklahoma. This wasn't fast food, it was a 40-minute commitment. In 1965, with chicken quarters at 29 cents a pound, this was the king of the menu. It started with a buttermilk soak overnight to keep the meat moist against the high heat of a cast iron skillet. It was dredged in heavily seasoned flour and fried low and slow until the crust turned a deep, structural golden brown. A good truck stop cook knew you couldn't rush it. If you did, you ended up with a pale crust and a pink bone. And a driver wouldn't forget that mistake for 1,000 miles. Then there was number 4, pinto beans and ham hock. In 1966, this 45-cent plate was the most honest thing you could order. It was the food of the frontier hearth brought to the highway, a pound of dried beans soaked overnight and simmered all day, with an onion and a smoked ham hock until the broth turned into a dark, thick nectar. It was served with a side of cornbread and a bottle of hot sauce, the cheapest and most filling fuel on the menu. Long haulers on a tight budget ordered this because it left enough in their pocket for a slice of pie, which was the only reason to stop in the first place. Finally, we reached number 3, pot roast with root vegetables. In 1968, for 65 cents, this was the foundation of the entire week. A chuck roast was browned hard on all sides, then bedded on carrots, potatoes, and onions to braise for 4 hours until it pulled apart in thick, yielding slabs. The braising liquid became the gravy, and nothing was wasted. By Tuesday, the leftovers became the hot beef sandwich. By Wednesday, the broth was the base for the stew. This was the economy of the American kitchen, a cycle of resourcefulness that required a cook who understood the value of every scrap. The corporate records don't show the skill it took to stretch one roast to feed 30 people over 3 days. But the drivers knew. They sat in the same booths, under the same yellowed light, and ate the history that the record keepers ignored. Every long-haul journey through the American night eventually leads to the same sweet conclusion. And in the golden age of the roadside diner, that conclusion was number 2, peach cobbler. In 1965, for 25 cents a slice, you weren't just buying dessert. You were buying a reason to keep your eyes open for another 100 miles of dark pavement. This was a deep baking dish filled with peaches, canned in the dead of winter or fresh from a Georgia orchard in the height of July, sweetened and spiced with cinnamon, and topped with rough biscuit dough dropped by the spoonful. It was baked until the fruit bubbled through the gaps like liquid amber, and the crust turned a perfect structural golden brown. Served warm with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that melted into the hot fruit before it even reached the counter, this wasn't a luxury for a driver coming off 9 hours on the highway. It was a necessity. Drivers from the panhandle of Texas to the mountains of West Virginia remembered the specific stops that got the crust right, and they would push through the exhaustion just to reach that one specific exit where the kitchen still smelled like caramelized sugar at midnight. Finally, we arrive at the absolute pinnacle of the American foodway, the dish that defined the culture of the truck stop more than any other. Number 1, the Blue Plate Special. This wasn't just a single recipe, it was a promise of consistency in an inconsistent world. Every truck stop from the rugged coast of Maine to the sun-bleached streets of San Diego had one, and it changed daily like a rhythmic heartbeat. Monday was pot roast, Tuesday was meatloaf, Wednesday was chicken and dumplings, Thursday was pork chops, and Friday was always catfish. In 1965, it cost 65 cents every single day, and it was made by a cook who had been doing it long enough that her hands knew the weight of the ladle before her brain did. Drivers who ran the same route every week from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf sat in the same vinyl booth and ordered without ever opening the menu, because the cook already had the plate on the tray before they finished their first cup of black coffee. That wasn't just a restaurant, it was a sanctuary, a piece of American life that we don't really have a name for anymore. We don't have it because the last of those great truck stop cooks retired sometime in the late 1980s, taking their secrets and their cast iron discipline with them into the quiet of history. The corporate chains moved in, the booths got smaller, the plates got lighter, and the highway that once smelled like chicken frying in a skillet at midnight now smells like every other exit in every other state. We must be honest and admit that these episodes compress decades of complex history and regional struggles into a few minutes. And while the mid-century wasn't a perfect time for everyone, the food had a soul that the modern assembly line can never replicate. These meals were the fuel of a nation in motion, built on the backs of people who understood that a working man needed more than just calories. He needed to be seen. You can still bring a piece of that Tuesday stew or that Sunday chicken back into your own kitchen if you're willing to put in the time and respect the seasoning of the pan. Tell me in the comments which of these forgotten classics you're making this week, and tell me if you have a specific exit number in your head right now that you still think about after all these years.